At some point in their life, almost everybody has looked at something built by professional builders like Gray or Scar and thought to themselves, there's no way I could build that. There seems to be some magical quality to their builds that just makes them look better, even when you try the same thing. No matter what you do, there just seems to be something about what they have built that makes it look amazing. It's like they have some secret trick that eludes the eye, but still makes it look just a little bit better. That trick isn't secret. Plenty of people have made videos about it, but so few mention that it should be central to everything you build. It's not just some useful trick with a few simple applications. It is absolutely central to creating the texture, depth, and atmosphere of a professional build. It's a trick that has been staring you in the face for ages. Gradients. At first glance, it seems to be simple and have little use, but look in the structures built by professionals, and it's everywhere. But you can't just put gradients anywhere. You need to know where to put them and how to make them. But keep watching, and you may soon understand the trick to the most important building technique in Minecraft. Now, gradients have quite a variety of uses, but one of the main ones they have is that they can draw the eyes up. For example, we can see here that in this gradient, if you were to look at it, your eyes are being pulled up, down from the bottom here, up to the top. This is in part what makes gradients effective. They can draw your eyes up and even make builds look taller. They can also break up the monotony and create movement in the build. For example, here, this isn't just all one big gray wall. We can see a clear direction of gradient as we look at it, and it helps break up that wall and add an interesting layer of depth to it. Gradients can also create an atmosphere. For example, in here, we can see this gradient running up the walls and up the pillars, and it makes this look much more dark and enclosed. This creates a gloomy atmosphere and really makes it feel dark and mysterious. Or, as we can see here, the gradients are used to kind of add a feeling of depth and gloominess as this mine shaft down here recedes into shadow. As we go down, we can see it starts to darken because we can't actually do that with the sun directly overhead. However, it still makes it feel darker and gloomier than it would if it were simply stone all the way down. Because there is a gradient here, it actually is surprisingly effective, even though this gradient is from nearly black to a very light gray. However, the fact that it is adding to this already perceived notion of depth really enhances that. This does bring me to one clear point. A gradient should not really be seen consciously. You shouldn't really see it. It should be more unconscious. You can even see that with this, which while it is quite clear that there is some green at the bottom and gray at the top, it is not really stand outing to the point where you can see there is a clear transition. You just kind of take it in without consciously registering where it changes. Similar to this, where while there is a gradient and your eyes do recognize that at some level, you're not thinking, why is the bottom of the tower dark? Because it's still just a subconscious recognition of the fact that it's there. Now, with gradients, it's useful to note that there's going to usually be a light side and a dark side. The dark side should go in areas of shadow or foreboding or gloom, as we can see with the ceiling here. The light side should reach up or towards brighter areas where you want to direct the eyes, which will usually be up, especially on mountains or castles. In this way, you can actually use gradients on things like mountains or tall castles to make them look higher than they actually are because of the nature of gradients, which causes forced perspective. This can be used especially in cases where Minecraft's normal height limit is highly preventative of extraordinarily tall buildings or structures. Now, to move on here, we can see that there's two quite clear different types of a gradient. Usually with any gradient, we will have two colors. The one color that we want to start with and the one color we want to end with. Usually one will be lighter or darker, but not necessarily. As we can see here, there is a light side at the top and a dark side at the bottom, and each side, the percentages of each slowly dwindle as they draw near the other side. This is a somewhat ineffective way of blending gradients, as it is quite clear and does not truly make a good distinction, as there's too much difference here. This is of course a very noticeable transition, as you can see, where you can quite clearly see there's dark patches here and light patches here, and that there are some very notable transitions between the two blocks. Alternatively, we have this, where you take this one block and the other, and you find every block between it, and then create a gradient like this, with one color moving up to the next. However, this does have the downside. While there is no certain point that marks the transition between the two colors, the lines of colors are very clearly notable. This brings us on to our third gradient, which is a combination of both. In this, you start at the dark side and move up to the light side, and while you do vary up the blocks, you also use a variety of colors. Thus, it is important to note that there is no clear delineation in both where one color begins and the other ends, and the different layers of colors. This is done through using many different colors in certain areas. It can almost be thought of as a series of zones, if you will, between the different colors, where each color is most probable in a certain area and fades out in others in an overlapping pattern that creates what we see here. This can perhaps be most clearly seen in this gradient, which was actually used in Grian's Season 8 starter home. In fact, this gradient, while it does have two very clearly distinct colors and shades, is quite unique in the fact that there is no single point that transitions between them. As we can see, we start off with mostly moss here, then mostly green wool here, then mostly mossy cobblestone, and then a mixture of stone and andesite that continues throughout the rest of the build. However, it's important to note that there is a clear mixture of the two. Even just one block from the bottom, it's not all moss, there is some green wool. Higher up, you immediately start to see some mossy cobblestone that is mixed really throughout, and farther up there is cobblestone. You can determine how much you want to mix the gradient based on your needs. In general, a larger build, or one that you want to have cleaner lines, will not have this much clear pattern, but the gradient will also be spread over a larger area. This does create a slightly chaotic effect, as there are some notable contrasts that can be seen, most notably with this green block here and this gray block here, surrounded by the other colors. However, this is not too clear in the build, and if you had a lot of this going around, it would not be very noticeable. You can in fact see a graph of the different colors and their respective amounts here, which is shown in a better version on the screen, but this clearly shows that there are a variety of places where different colors take effect. At the beginning, it's mostly one, but that soon phases into the others and the others in a repeating cycle that eventually ends up with the stone and andesite mixture. Finally, it's useful to note that the gradients should be planned out in their respective amounts. A gradient should not consist of equal amounts of each color, but rather want to consider how much each color contributes to the gradient. For example, in this, we can see that there is a clear area down from here to up to here of mossy cobblestone, while there's only 3 blocks here of the moss. Thus, a gradient should not just be uniform distributed throughout, but it should be designed in a way specific to how it is meant to be interpreted. In this gradient, there's supposed to be a short, small gradient at the bottom leading up to the main color of the house, which would continue much higher up. It's simply supposed to blend down into the ground. Thus, the layers at the bottom will be quite short. Also, you want greater amounts of materials in places where there's a greater gap between materials. Here, we can see that there is a rather large gap between the wool and the mossy cobblestone, with one being clearly green and one being clearly gray. Mossy cobblestone is used in a large expanse, as is the wool, while the normal moss and normal cobblestone are used in very few places. This is similar to this, how in an area where you have a larger distinction between the two, between this andesite and this red nether brick, you want a larger space to blend the two, whereas in an area with far more colors and less ranges in the colors, you want less area for each color. With the creation of gradients, it's important to note that you should probably have a series of different gradients you use for different colors. Here, for example, we can see a series of gradients going between a dark gray and a light gray, which are used throughout these builds. These are what might be called master gradients, as they detail every block that can be used. When using a gradient directly into a structure, you generally only want to use a few colors because you want the gradient to be more subconscious. Gradients should be used in almost any build and any structure. However, they should be used cautiously, only a few colors, to just subconsciously affect how you view the build. For example, in Grian's Season 7 mansion, we can see how there are 3 clear colors. However, the gradient is spread across a very large expanse, and thus is not very clearly delineated. Also, we can see that the gradient has clear transitions between the two, so it doesn't look chaotic. And while there is a distinct boundary between the layers, because the colors are so close and the area is so wide, it's not generally noticed. However, extreme gradients can be used in areas where you want them to be used well. For example, in here, we can see there is a gradient going from light gray wool all the way to a gray concrete, a very noticeable gradient. However, this works in conjunction with the lighting, which causes a searing of gloom. The purpose of this gradient is not to go unnoticed, but rather to be noticed and to add to the atmosphere. These could be considered atmospheric gradients and enhance the lighting and other effects. This can also be noted in the mine shaft, where there is a gradient going from black all the way up to a light stone. However, this is clearly meant to be seen, as it is meant to impact how the viewer views the mine shaft. It makes it seem darker and gloomy at the bottom, as opposed to being just one color. This is another example of a gradient that is, to some extent, meant to be seen. Unlike gradients that should be used in most, if not all, buildings, this gradient is somewhat meant to be seen. However, it is not perceived clearly, and rather just subconsciously alters the view, though it can be clear to anyone looking at it that it is green at the bottom and gray at the top. This is a clear distinction between the two types of gradients, atmospheric and just aesthetic, as with an aesthetic gradient, you don't want it to be noticed unless someone expressly looks for it, whereas with atmospheric, it should aid their perception of the build and impact how the see the atmosphere. However, atmospheric gradients can also be used in places where one would traditionally just use an aesthetic gradient. For example, in this castle, there is a clear, small, dark gradient that only runs a few blocks to the main color of the castle. However, this darkens the bottom of the castle near the foundation, adding an interesting layer of depth. This can also be done in the seashores by darkening the rock lower to the water for a small transition up to the main color of the cliffs. Thus, all of these tricks should be used when making gradients, and gradients should be carefully considered and put into every build. Also, please do consider subscribing if you would like to see more of this type of content and help support the channel at the same time. It helps out a lot and allows me to keep creating this type of content.